So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course on Feminist Writings, where we're looking at Bell Hooks' essay Understanding Patriarchy, which will hopefully begin to wind up and we'll hope to end that essay today. So in the last section we talked about how Hooks offers some very interesting and complex and disturbing anecdotal evidence from our own life in terms of being a child growing up in a very patriarchal family, a female child growing up in a patriarchal family, and also the example that she gave of a partner, a friend of hers, who had this very interesting transition from being a sensitive, meek person to a patriarchal, quote-unquote, macho person, and how that shift into macho-ness got him more visibility and agency in a competitive office space. So these things become very interesting examples, and those also exemplify how patriarchy will reward you, like any grand narrative will reward you for conforming to it. So if you conform to patriarchy, if you conform to any grand narrative, in this case the grand narrative being patriarchy, we find that you get rewards such as visibility, agency, respect, respectability, etc. So obviously that becomes an incentive for people to drop their guard, to drop their subversive, sensitive persona, and then become just blind and passive conformists to that particular grand narrative. Now, one of the interesting things which this essay has done already is that it looks at patriarchy almost as a medical condition, as a condition which affects us medically, affects us as a disease collectively. And she says quite clearly that unless we can address the problem at a core level by acknowledging it, by articulating it, there's very little chance that we have in terms of moving away from it or deconstructing it, because she says quite clearly in this essay there's a degree of reticence, a degree of reluctance to actually name the word patriarchy, let alone discuss it or address it or unpack it. So unless you can name the word patriarchy, unless you can name the problem as patriarchy at a core level, then obviously it becomes almost an experience impossible to move on and then dissect or deconstruct it. And this is what she says in this section, which should be on your screen, where she says quite clearly that until we can collectively acknowledge the damage patriarchy causes and the suffering it creates, we cannot address male pain. Now, interestingly, as I may have mentioned already, that one of the interesting and refreshingly radical things which this essay does is that it completely problematizes the ontology and experientiality of victimhood. I'll say it again, it problematizes the ontology and experientiality of victimhood in a sense that it looks at how patriarchy, the first victims of patriarchy are the men who inherit patriarchy and unquestionably and then become perpetrators of patriarchy. And obviously this inheritance and then subsequent perpetration make them move away from their true agency, from the true agentic self, and they become like sort of conforming machines, conforming codes into the grand narrative of patriarchy. So the male pain obviously is a lack of agency. The male pain over here is the effect patriarchy has as a condition, as a discursive, cultural, almost medical condition as Hooks sees it. We cannot demand for men the right to be whole, to be givers and sustainers of life. So unless we can address the problem of patriarchy, unless we can collectively acknowledge the problem of patriarchy, we cannot expect men to become whole, W-H-O-L-E. So the idea of fragmentation becomes very important in this particular essay, and Hooks is quite clear in saying that so people who perpetrate patriarchy, men who perpetrate patriarchy, they become fragmented as selves because they move away from the holistic and whole understanding of their own agentic self, and then they become passive perpetrators of a particular patriarchal code, a particular patriarchal narrative, a particular patriarchal performance. Now, so we cannot expect them to be whole, we cannot expect them to be holistic or sensitive or givers and sustainers of life unless we collectively address the problem of patriarchy, we collectively acknowledge and articulate the problem of patriarchy. Now, obviously, some patriarchal men are reliable and even benevolent caretakers and providers, but still they are imprisoned by a system that undermines their mental health. So again, this becomes almost a mental health problem as examined by Hooks, and she says that patriarchy affects you psychologically. Patriarchy is a form of psychological violence, psychological terrorism. It can create traumatic experiences, it can generate traumatic experiences. So unless we look at patriarchy as a problem, as almost a medical problem, then we can never be free from it. And then interestingly, she says that it is possible, perhaps, at some level, to be very benevolent and generous and kind patriarchal men, but then those men are still imprisoned by the narratives of patriarchy. So despite the kindness, despite the benevolence, despite the generosity, spiritual, emotional, financial, material, whatever form the generosity might take, it will still be refracted to the lenses of patriarchy. It will still be mediated by the mirrors of patriarchy, and unless we can free ourselves from that, then there's very little chance we've got to emerge as feminists or people who want an equality of gender relations. So patriarchy promotes insanity. So this is quite refreshing, because like Franz Fanon, bell hooks over here, she has a degree of directness about her essays. So there's not a lot of discursive jargon dropping that we see over here, and so what we see is a freshness and directness that she uses and appropriates in terms of what she wants to convey over here, where she's saying quite clearly the patriarchy promotes insanity. It is at the root of the psychological ills troubling men in our nation. Nevertheless, there is no mass concern for the plight of men. And then there's a reference to a book called Stift, The Betrayal of the American Man, by someone called Suzanne Faludi. And then while Hooks appreciates the book, appreciates the content of the book, she's a bit unhappy with the fact that this particular book, although it takes up the problem of men, the betrayal of the American man, it doesn't spend sufficient time talking about patriarchy. It doesn't talk about sufficient time in terms of how patriarchy promotes insanity, how patriarchy promotes aberrational behavior, violent behavior, how those become psychological conditions which people suffer due to patriarchy. Now, and then she goes on to, she sort of critiques Faludi to a certain extent, and then she says quite clearly, as is on your screen at the moment, where she's saying Faludi never interrogates the notion of control. She never considers the notion that men were somehow in control, in power, and satisfied with their lives before contemporary feminist movement is false, right? So the entire idea that feminism disempowered men is an erroneous argument, which is not something which is picked up sufficiently by Faludi's book. Because the way Hooks looks at it, and it's a very interesting perspective, she says that feminism is supposed to empower women as well as men, because the whole point of feminism is to defeat patriarchy, is to sort of situate itself in resistance to patriarchy, right? And if you can do that, then obviously you make men less patriarchal in quality, and then that obviously makes them more holistic, more of a whole person. So in that sense, patriarchy is supposed to designed to empower women as well as men. So again, we're looking away, we're looking beyond the binary of men being the problem and women being the rescue mission. Now, unless we can move beyond that binary, then according to Hooks, we don't have much of a chance in terms of looking at a really gender equal world, right? So patriarchy could be seen as a system which oppresses men as well as women. Feminism should be seen as a system which empowers men as well as women, right? So unless we have this inclusive, holistic approach to gender equality, to gender relationship, there is very little chance, according to Hooks, in terms of really empowering men and women. So patriarchy as a system has denied males access to full emotional well-being, which is not the same as feeling rewarded, successful, or powerful because of one's capacity to assert control over others. So the question of agency becomes quite problematic. So the question of agency, according to Hooks, is to have absolute access to your emotional well-being, is to have absolute access to your emotional core. And that kind of agency, that order of agency, should not be equated with the agency which comes out of being successful or being the dominant self in a particular setting. So that sense of agency cannot be equated with a sense of agency which is acquired by having a full access to what you really are as a feeling, emotional person. And obviously patriarchy denies men access to that kind of personhood, and in denying men access to that kind of personhood, it makes men victims of patriarchy, victims of a certain kind of delusion. And that delusion then quickly masquerades as power, quickly masquerades as domination, etc., which then creates or generates a pseudo sense of agency. So that pseudo agency, which comes out of domination, must be contrasted with the real agency, which can come only through full access to or absolute access to your core emotional self. So to truly address male pain and male crisis, we must as a nation be willing to experience the harsh reality that patriarchy has damaged men in the past and continues to damage them in the present. So the idea of the bruise, the wound caused by patriarchy is not just psychological, it's cultural, it's almost biological in quality as well. I mean, that wound, that damage can extend over all kinds of domains, linguistic domains, the way people are trained or predisposed to speak, the way people are hardwired to speak, people are sort of designed or trained or coded to behave in certain settings. So patriarchy can create a generation of bruised men and women, wounded men and women, because they're wounded psychologically, because they are tricked into believing by patriarchy that domination is agency, that control is agency, coercion is agency, command is agency, being in power is being agentic. So these false equations between agency and power, between agency and domination, must be done away with, and it can only be done away with only if you can question the very ontology, the very core of patriarchy, which is the problem that affects men and women over here. Okay, so if patriarchy were truly rewarding to men, suppose for the sake of argument we think that patriarchy were truly rewarding to men, then the violence and addiction in family life that is also pervasive would not exist. So if patriarchy were really rewarding, existentially, emotionally, at a core human level, then you wouldn't have so much of abusive behavior, so much of alcoholism, so much of violence, which affects men and women in domestic, competitive, commercial settings, workplaces as well. So patriarchy cannot be a benevolent construct. Patriarchy cannot really be a giver of agency. Patriarchy cannot be really a benefiting condition at all, because the empirical proof suggests otherwise, spectacularly suggests otherwise. Okay. So the violence was not created by feminism. So this is again a very important and interesting distinction that she's making, that she's saying that it is extremely erroneous and extremely dangerous to look at feminism as something which damaged men, right? Because that's something which men and sometimes even feminists would like to believe, that feminism is disempowering men and empowering women. Now, obviously, if you're using that as a construct, if you're using that as a category, as a dualistic category, then you again falling back in this very normative understanding of power, dualism, gender binary, etc., which the whole purpose of feminism should be to do away with completely, right? So feminism should be seen as a construct, as a form of knowledge, as a system which is designed, which aspires to empower men and women, and that empowerment can only happen if patriarchy is done away with, right? So the entire dissolution of patriarchy should be the aspiration of feminism, not just a partial empowerment of women and a partial disempowerment of men, because the whole point is, if we dissolve patriarchy, if we attack patriarchy, if we resist patriarchy, you're emancipating not just women but also men, and that's a very important point that Hooks is making over here. Okay, so violence in men is not created by feminism, it's actually created by patriarchy, because this constant compulsion to conform to certain codes of conduct, the constant compulsion to conform to certain codes of behavior, certain codes of appropriation, consumption, identity formation, etc., that generates violence, that necessitates violence sometimes. And of course, as we have seen already in this essay, that section where Hooks offered example from our own childhood, a very patriarchal setting would actually teach a young boy, a young male child, that violence is good, violence is something which is part of the masculinity package. If you're not violent enough, you're not masculine enough. So this, again, it's a very problematic equation between violence, aggression, and masculinity. Is something the patriarchy produces and promotes quite consistently. Okay, so the violence is not created by feminism. If patriarchy were rewarding, the overwhelming dissatisfaction most men feel in their work lives, the dissatisfaction extensively documented in the works of Sturkell and echoed in Felides' treatise, would not exist. So if patriarchy were holistically rewarding, if patriarchy were existentially rewarding to men, they would not have so much dissatisfaction, which is documented in so many works. So that documented dissatisfaction is something that men suffer all the time in workplace and families and other kinds of settings as well. And that dissatisfaction stems from patriarchy, not despite patriarchy, but because of patriarchy. And that's a very important point that that Hooks is making over here. Okay, so and then the essay ends quite interestingly by looking at men not as a threat but as a collaborator, as a comrade to the entire gender struggle, the entire gender politics, the entire gender revolution. So if we really want to have a revolution in gender in terms of bringing in an equality of gender relationship, then it's absolutely imperative to look at men and women as comrades in struggle. And this is obviously a book, a work that Hooks herself had produced at some point in time, which had been referred to in his essay as well. So the point that she is making over here is that otherwise, unless we can do that, men will continue to fear that any critique of patriarchy represents a threat, right? So any critique of patriarchy should be seen as not a critique of men, but actually it's a mode which can be used potentially to emancipate men from the clutches of patriarchy, from the prison house of patriarchy, right? And that can only be done by making it more inclusive in quality. The entire idea of patriarchy should be made more inclusive in quality. Distinguishing political patriarchy, which he sees, and this is obviously a reference to the psychologist over here, which he sees as as largely committed to ending sexism. A therapist, Terence Real, whose book was referred to already, makes clear that the patriarchy damaging us all is embedded in our psyches. So this is a very crucial point, because what Hooks has already said and what Terence Real's book, The Therapist, Terence Real's book demonstrates quite clearly, is that patriarchy operates at a very subterranean psychological level. And that subterranean psychological level must be unpacked, must be seen as a construct of different kinds of indoctrination, of different kinds of forceful and violent appropriations that men have to do early on in their lives, as infants, as boys, as children, as teenagers, as adolescents, as young men, etc., different phases of life. So what is this damage? What is the psychological damage that Terence Real talks about? Psychological patriarchy is a dynamic between those qualities deemed masculine and feminine, in which half of our human traits are exalted while the other half is devalued. Now, obviously, if you're looking at a very binaristic and blunt understanding of masculinity and femininity, then that kind of understanding comes with a degree of valuation. So, stereotypically patriarchal masculinist values are heralded, are exalted as positive values, as things which ought to be celebrated, whereas the quote-unquote feminine values, again, this is very stereotypical, are devalued as things which are weak, things which are markers of weakness, markers of lack of strength, lack of conviction, lack of confidence, lack of authority. So obviously, the desirable, coveted codes belong to the patriarchal codes, because that's the whole point of patriarchy. That's the whole point of producing this fantasy of patriarchy, that we create those codes which you make desirable through circulation and consumption. Rather than that desirability quotient is very, very important in patriarchy, because if we take away that desirability, that coveted quotient, then obviously the entire aspiration to be patriarchal, the entire reward of being patriarchal would be done away with, and that would be a death knell to patriarchy. And that's exactly what Hooks advocates, that if we are to deal a death knell, a death blow to patriarchy, then you must take away the coveted quality of patriarchy, and you must take away the desirability quotient of patriarchy, because only if you can do that can men and women both become more sensitive and more resistant to patriarchy as a strategy. So both men and women participate in this tortured value system. So this is a very, very lopsided value system, which is tortured, which is quite perverse actually. And then obviously it naturalizes and normativizes its perversity, and then it produces this grand narrative of patriarchy as a production system. Psychological patriarchy is a dance of contempt, a perverse form of connection that replaces true intimacy with complex, covert layers of dominance and submission, collusion and manipulation. So these are very, very important verbs which are used by Hooks over here. So she says that patriarchy does away with true intimacy, true affective, A-F-F-E-C-T-I-V-E, true affective kinship. And what it does instead of affective, existential, emotional kinship or intimacy, what it promotes is submission, manipulation, dominance, and collusion. So all these categories become quite problematic, because all these categories rely on power struggle, all these categories rely on power dynamics, power inequality, etc., manipulation, collusion, submission, dominance. They all, if you look at each of these terms, you find they're all embedded in power inequality, and that's something the patriarchy would want to promote and perpetuate, the inequality of power, this fantasy of inequality of power. It is the unacknowledged paradigm of relationships that has suffused Western civilization generation after generation. So it's like a subterranean layer which has informed Western civilization through generations, through the history of time, deforming both sexes and destroying the passionate bond between them. So, destroying true intimacy, destroying true emotional relationship. We have instead a manipulative relationship of dominance and submission and manipulation and collusion, which patriarchy promotes and protects and perpetuates through different forms, covertly and overtly. By highlighting psychological patriarchy, we see that everyone is implicated and we are freed from the misperception that men are the enemy. So again, the whole idea of problematizing the idea of men being the enemy and perpetrator and women being the sufferers and victims of patriarchy should be questioned, should be deconstructed, and instead the focus should shift on patriarchy, the ontology of patriarchy, the evolution of patriarchy, the functionality of patriarchy, which makes men as well as women sufferers in its clutches. To end patriarchy, we must challenge both its psychological and its concrete manifestations in daily life. So the psychological quality and the material quality of patriarchy must be identified and questioned, must be done away with, must be deconstructed. There are folks who are able to critique patriarchy but unable to act in an anti-patriarchal manner. So this is a very important collaboration that Hooks is suggesting, and this is something I may have mentioned at the very beginning of this course, that when you look at a course like Feminist Writings, it's a bit problematic and a bit reductionist to look at everything as a text that can be discussed and dissected and unpacked. So the textuality quotient and the experientiality quotient must be combined together, especially when you look at something like patriarchy, because patriarchy is not just a text which is created, but it's also an experience which is embodied, an experience which is lived in daily life. So we should be able to critique patriarchy as a textual strategy, as well as enact that critique in the way we live our daily lives. To end male pain, to respond effectively to male crisis, we have to name the problem. We have to identify the problem, name the problem as patriarchy, and then begin to attack and unpack it. We have to both acknowledge that the problem is patriarchy and work to end patriarchy as collaborators, men and women coming together. Terence Real offers us valuable insight. The reclamation of wholeness, again, the question of wholeness becomes very important because what Hooks is suggesting, and obviously she's drawing on the therapist, Terence Real here as well, that if we become victims of patriarchy, we begin to live partial lives. We begin to live fragmented lives because then we begin to conform to the codes of patriarchy and move away from our true holistic agentic self, our true holistic existential self. And rather we start living patriarchal as patriarchal performers, a performance of patriarchy. So the reclamation of wholeness is a process even more fraught for men than it has been for women, more difficult and more profoundly threatening to the culture at large. If men are to reclaim the essential goodness of male being, if they are to regain the space of open-heartedness and emotional expressiveness that is the foundation of well-being, we must envision alternatives to patriarchal masculinity. We must all change. So this is the very revolutionary, almost revolutionary quality with which the essay ends, and it's quite, again, it's very direct and fresh in its addresses making over here. So she's saying quite clearly, we must find alternative masculinities. We must find sufficient, robust alternatives to patriarchal masculinity. And in our search for robust and livable and viable alternatives to patriarchal masculinity, we must all change as men and women. We must take into account the struggle of men and the struggle of women, the sufferings of men and the sufferings of women. We must move away from any kind of binaristic understanding of the sufferer and the perpetrator, and we all must come together as collaborators to address and unpack and articulate the problem of patriarchy. Unless we can do that, then patriarchy will just keep producing and protecting its own codes of behavior. So the way to contest patriarchy, the way to combat patriarchy, the way to do away with patriarchy is all change together, collectively, as men and women, as comrades in the struggle against patriarchy. So with that, the essay ends, but then just to summarize very quickly, what this essay does very interestingly and radically, I think, is it completely problematizes the ontology of victimhood, the ontology of suffering, the ontology of this dualism of the male perpetrator and the woman sufferer. It questions, it opens up the question of agency. It looks at how the question of pseudo-agency, which comes from domination, manipulation, and then power struggle, which patriarchy promotes, how the pseudo-agency should be contrasted with a holistic and existential sense of agency that patriarchy takes you away from. So obviously the question of agency becomes very important as well. But this is a very potent and very powerful and very provocative piece of feminist writing, so that's the reason why we began our course with this. Hopefully you got something out of it, and obviously we'll come back to it, and we'll keep referring to this particular essay as we move on in the other texts to come in this course. So thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next lecture with a different text. Thank you.